All right, so first out the chute is egoism. And I'm going to start this with a little story from you, and this comes from Plato's book. It's called The Myth of Gyges. And in the Myth of Gyges, I'm going to do a Fred paraphrase of this. So you have this shepherd boy. He's just out being a regular shepherd boy in ancient Greece. He's got his flocks, and one day he comes across this burial cairn. And it's like standing stones that had been laid, creating a chamber underneath, and then they're covered like with a mound of dirt. So he goes into this, and there's like a throne in there with a skeleton, and there's a gold ring on the skeleton. And he takes the ring, and he notices the next couple days as he's fiddling with it, if he turns it a certain way, he becomes invisible. And he starts by doing petty thefts, like stealing pies out of people's windows or being a peeping Tom or a voyeur. But by the end, he actually seduces the king's wife, murders the king, takes over the kingdom, and he's pretty much turned into a pretty nefarious character. And at the end of the story, Plato's conclusion is, and so would every last one of you if you had that ability. If you had the ability to be invisible and no one could hold you account for your actions, God or man, no one could hold you accountable. And Plato claims that ethics is for the weak, it's for the herd, it's for the people that can't impose their will on others, because the strong don't need it. The strong can do what they want, when they want, how they want. It's the poor and weak and feeble among us that band together to make these artificial rules to try to protect us from the strong and powerful. What do you think about that? Is that true? If we had the power of invisibility, that's a great prompt question to ask entry-level ethics students, is if you could have the superpower of flying or invisibility, which would you take? You do not want to choose invisibility, because if you say invisibility, the follow-up question is, why do you want to be invisible? Because there's really not a lot of good reasons to be invisible. It's usually up to no good, right? And I had one student say, oh, it's because I want to do good things for others without them knowing who did it. Like, I thought, okay, that's beautiful, but I think that's probably not very likely. But if that's why you want to be invisible, more power to you. This idea, if you saw the remake of The Invisible Man with Francis Bacon, there's a really horrifying scene where he's been invisible and he's turned into a pretty bad character, and his girlfriend's confronting him. And she says, how can you do all those horrible things? And he says, you'd be amazed what you can do when you don't have to look at yourself in the mirror. And I just thought, yeah, that's the truth, right? And so I would say this is perhaps the oldest of all the ethics. Maybe the theory was developed later, but the practice goes all the way to the beginning. Even if you take a Judeo-Christian worldview, Adam and Eve were acting out of self-interest, what they thought was good for them, and that's what egoism is. What's good for me is good, what's bad for me is bad. Plain and simple. So it's a really easy ethical theory to navigate. Whenever you get into a dilemma or a quandary, you simply ask yourself, is this good for me, Fred Blackburn? If the answer is yes, I proceed. If the answer is no, I find something else to do. If I say yes and it turns out not to be good, then I change course and I pick something else to do. So that's the nice thing about egoism. It's flexible and you can change. You don't just have to keep banging your head into the wall because God or your mama or your school told you to do something. If you find out something's not working or in your best interest, go around it. Find some other way to proceed. So that is egoism in a nutshell. What's good for me is good. What's bad for me is bad. Self-interest and selfishness become synonyms, and altruism is a myth. Can anyone define for me what altruism means?
Isn't that like charity?
Yes, it's doing good for goodness sake. You're not hoping for reward. You're not hoping that someone sees what a good person you are. You are simply doing good because it's the right thing to do. And an egoist would say, you're just fooling yourself and others. There's no such thing. Everyone always does what they think is in their own best interest. Okay? Now, when we turn to psychology, and specifically, I want to direct your attention to Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, if you're familiar with that. And in the book, I think I have an illustration. So it's like a pyramid. And on the bottom, we have self-preservation, this idea, first we need to take care of our physical well-being, like food, shelter, water, those sorts of things. And then the highest rung, as we move up through the pyramid, is self-actualization. But as you can see, it's self at the bottom, all the way to self at the top. It's all about me, myself, and I. And psychologically, we understand that is the way humans are wired. We are the center of our universe. All perceptions come to us. For example, if you go to a lake or a pier on a moonless night, and the lake or the ocean on a pier on a moonless night, and you're looking out at the moonlight over the water, there could be 100 people on that pier with you, but that moonlight is going to be coming from the horizon across the water right to your eyes. How crazy is that? You are the center of your universe. So it makes sense that you're going to make decisions and ethical choices and determine right based on your personal perception and what's good for you. With this psychological egoism, we also have layers or degrees of egoism. The first is called universal. So we have psychological egoism, which is simply saying that is the way we're wired, our self. And think about Freud, his idea of we have the ego, which is our conscious awareness of ourself. When I say I, me, or mine, that is my ego speaking. But we also have an id and a superego, right? So there's this subconscious, these desires and cravings and passions below the surface that are affecting my view of myself. But there's also a superego that is imposed upon us by, like, our culture, our schools, our families, telling us the kind of person we ought to be. And so we're often trying to live up to this superego standard, but our ego often has a hard time navigating these feelings, passions, drives, cravings from the subconscious to these imposed super expectations above. And the ego is kind of in between, trying to navigate these two things. So ethicists, when they look at the psychological data, they come to egoism and they talk about three categories. So we have ethical egoism, can include universal, which simply acknowledges everyone is an egoist. Everyone is looking out for their own self-interest. So when you're negotiating with someone, like say you're going to buy a car and someone goes, oh, you're one of those college students? I've got a deal for you. Well, just say, hey, I'm going to try to buy the car get the most value for the least amount of money I can, and you're going to try to get as much commission or profit as you can. So let's negotiate and have a win-win situation instead of you winning and me losing, or me winning and you losing. You're acknowledging everyone is out for their own best interest. So if we can do that together, maybe we can both come out ahead. Okay. The next would be private personal egoism. And private personal egoism is basically you pretend to be an altruist, but inside you're practicing self-interest. You're looking out for yourself. But you've found out over the years that by being giving, by being generous, by helping others, others will then help you. But see, your motivation isn't because of the other, it's so that you will get helped in the future. Or it could simply be you don't want to feel the guilt or shame for not helping someone else because maybe you were brought up Judeo-Christian and you were taught to not look at your own self-interest, but those of others. You're not to put yourself first, but others before you. And so part of how people overcome that is they put up this facade of being a giving, generous person, but behind the mask, behind the veil, they're just self-serving. And I'm sure all of you have met family members or roommates or neighbors who would fall into those categories, and it's quite unpleasant. And once they've been discovered or found out, they're not going to get help from people anymore. And then last is the most extreme, and it's usually only found among adolescents and third world dictators, and this is called egomania or a megalomaniac. And this is where someone believes that they are the center of the universe. So a universal egoist would wake up in the morning and think, what can I do to make this the best possible day for me? An egomaniac or megalomaniac would wake up thinking the same thing, but then I would also say Josiah should wake up thinking, what can I do to make this the best possible day for Fred? Samuel should wake up and be like, what can I do to make Blackburn shine in ethics class? What kind of softball question can I pitch him so he can knock it out of the park and look brilliant? And all of you might want to have like little portraits of me in your house so you can be in constant devotion and thinking about what you can do to please me. And this is what we see, right? In third world dictators, they want their image up in everyone's home, or adolescents who think literally the world evolves around them. Like my poor niece, she's 16. Like when she goes out, she literally thinks everyone is looking at her and evaluating her. I mean, what pressure, right? I would never leave the house if I thought everyone was judging and critiquing me everywhere I went. But I was a teenager once too, and I get it. It's part of our developmental process. But part of becoming mature, normally at least, is getting beyond self-interest. What the egoists are saying is, since we are psychologically wired this way, why should we let other people tell us we have to look out for other people when those same people are looking out for themselves? And so let's all just be honest, let's all be real and admit we're all looking out for ourselves, and we need to learn how to negotiate that with each other. And that is egoism in a nutshell. I got a couple minutes left, so I want to give you a couple variations on this theme, however. A cousin theory to egoism is hedonism, and this was developed by Epicurus, and maybe I'll do a little video on this later, even in this class if you guys want me to. And it's called hedonism, which states pleasure is good, pain is evil. So the idea is we want to do activities that give us pleasure and avoid things that cause us pain. Well, John Piper got a hold of this, and he wrote a thing called Christian hedonism. And he says, if it's true that pleasure is the greatest good, well, the greatest pleasure a human could experience is to be in right relationship with God. And so he kind of takes this very self-interest, selfish theory, and he flips it on its head. He kind of like baptizes hedonism, and that makes perfect sense, right? What greater pleasure could you have being with God who is pleased with you for eternity? That's the most blessed, pleasurable existence you could have. And I thought that's very interesting. I also think this theory lines up with what the Bible says about human beings, where we all seek our own way. We all seek our own self-interest, right? That is the human condition. And that is really the original sin. It's where we placed our self-will above the will of God. God gave a command, but Adam and Eve decided they wanted to do what they wanted for what they thought would be in their best interest. And so that is egoism. I don't have really time to do the critique of it, but if you watch the hour-long video in my survey, you'll get that. But I think that gives you a good overview and understanding of what egoism is. Last thing I want to say is the greatest ego in the universe is God himself. And if we are made think about it. God claims everything was made for his glory, for his purpose, for his pleasure. It's not about us, it's not about you, it's not about me, it's about God. And God's ego permeates the cosmos. And if we are made in the image of God, it would make sense that we too would have like a mini me, a mini ego that wants the same thing, where we try to place ourselves first. But this is the great difference between egoism and how I perceive Christianity. We are asked to die to self, to be crucified with Christ, and the newness of life that we now live is the very Spirit of Christ, or Spirit of God within us, the Holy Spirit in us. Now, if that is the ego that is directing you, go for it. But if it's that ego, that old man who is dead in Adam, then I think you might want to find a different ethical theory.